Okay, so thank you for joining us for this e-briefing, Voting in the Time of Corona. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. There's a lot of uncertainty out there right now, and the only certainty that I'm seeing is that the November 2020 election is going to look a lot different than what we expected even just 2 weeks ago. So we wanted to bring together some state and local election administrators who could provide some insight about what they've been experiencing so far with respect to running elections during the primaries, but also to talk about what they think might be necessary ahead of the November election. We'll also be joined by MIT professor Charles Stewart, who has thoughts on how voters may choose to participate this fall and many other parts of the process. So let me just go quickly over the ground rules. If you look on the side of your Teams box, there should be a chat function. The chat is where we'd like you all to ask any questions. I will try to get to as many questions as possible throughout the session, but please put them there and also identify both yourself and any organization that you're part of, and we will get to them there. The other thing is that this session will be recorded and posted to BPC's website later today. So I want to make sure that everyone was clear on that. So with that, I'm going to start by asking the first question to David Stafford. David is the supervisor of elections in Escambia County, Florida. He has the distinction of being one of the few election officials in the world who's run an in-person election in the age of the coronavirus. Florida voted in its primary last Tuesday. And so David, certainly those were very different circumstances than planning for November. However, you made some immediate changes, and certainly any insights you could have into what was necessary and what you think there's now time to scale up ahead of November.
Well, thank you, Matt. First of all, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. We've seen our share of emergencies and disasters here in Florida. Hurricanes certainly come to mind. My colleague, a couple of my colleagues to my east here, certainly lived through Hurricane Michael and made tremendous strides just in order to be able to pull off that election in 2018. We've seen similar things in other states, Superstorm Sandy up in the Northeast, et cetera. But this was very different because it was a building narrative that was coming, and there was a lot of uncertainty, as there continues to be uncertainty. So each day, as we got closer and closer to the election, there was some new piece of information that we had to deal with. So the first thing that we saw was polling places and poll workers started to get obviously concerned about the news and what they were hearing from the national and state and local level. And so most immediately, my colleagues and I started dealing with polling places that became unavailable. We did some affirmative reach out ahead of time to those facilities that we thought might have an issue, particularly because of their population. Initially, they were fine, and they were going to make some accommodations to allow us to continue to use them. Then as time wore on, as time got closer, first thing that happened is the corporate umbrella over one of our ALFs said, hey, we got word from above, we can't do it. So fortunately, we were able to identify a suitable location to replace that in the same day. And then the next one, they were holding on, and then finally, the governor made an announcement and said, put some restrictions upon access to ALFs, and so we moved that one again same day. So, and that was only two for me. Some of my colleagues, particularly some in the southeast part of the state, lost quite a few polling places, and so that was sort of one of your big things. Where are you going to actually hold this election? And then secondly, the personnel side. Who are you going to get to hold it? Because obviously, everybody on this call knows that poll workers skew old, and that is the vulnerable population. So if you think about where we were in those days leading up to the 17th, there was still a lot of uncertainty. Well, I think it was that morning of the 16th, which was the president's announcement. It was the day before the election, the president's announcement about gatherings of 10 or fewer. So then that started sort of a second round of people. So the polling places and the personnel were probably the two biggest things. And then the third part was the supplies. And so we were in the same boat as everybody else, trying to find hand sanitizer and wipes and things along those lines. Our supply lines, our normal supply chains were interrupted for those kinds of supplies. And so we were left scrambling. For instance, I got a call, loved getting the call on Sunday evening, said we've identified some hand sanitizer for you. I said, great. It's in Orlando. So just for those geographically, give you a sense of where I am in Florida. I'm in the northwesternmost part of the state. I'm closer to Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans than I am to Orlando. It's a 450 mile drive, and that's where the supplies were. So we had to deal with that. We ended up getting them, but as you can imagine, trying to send somebody 450 miles on the day before the election is really not feasible. We were able to make arrangements with some of my colleagues, but those were some of the more immediate issues. And now, sort of actually election day for us, and I think for most of the state, went fairly smoothly given the circumstances. But it was that uncertainty leading up to election day. And the other thing, and the thing that I said when we were talking about this the other day, was that election officials are not public health officials, and we were forced into that role, which is a role, again, we're not suited for. And so that added to sort of the complexity of pulling off the election. So all in all, looking back, it's remarkable, I think, that it went as smoothly on election day as it did. But certainly now that we have some of us have time to plan for, our next primary, for instance, here in Florida, and then of course the general election. I certainly think there are some, we've got to start thinking about all the different contingencies about what the situation with polling places and poll workers might look like. And then, of course, the challenges to ramping up, say, with vote by mail. So anyway, it was, like I said, it was something that I wouldn't wish on anybody, but we were able to make it through. We had what I would say was some good leadership from our association and from our state. And we, pulled out all stops, reaching out for resources all across the country, and we're able to get it done.
Thank you. Steve Trout is the director of elections in Oregon. Oregon is the leader in going to all vote by mail. They've been doing it for about 30 years. So, Steve, a lot of both policymakers, administrators, just the public thinks, okay, so we'll just switch to a vote by mail election. We just won't do the polling places. Now, that may be something that states are going to have to do for remaining primaries, just because we're likely to be under these stay-at-home orders for quite some time. And these primaries have to happen in the next couple of weeks. But for November, I mean, is it possible to go to all vote by mail? What would it take to get up to speed? And any thoughts you have on that transition, how long it took Oregon to do?
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of our learning. There's no one size fits all in election, even vote by mail. I mean, there's going to be challenges there. And, but we've learned a lot, and I'm a big proponent of vote by mail. There's a lot of things in this pandemic that I don't have to worry about, but there still are things that we need to worry about. As far as the voter-centered piece of this, we're going to send a ballot out to them. They're going to return it, and that part's going to be somewhat normal. The challenge is going to be then on the back end, where we have still manual processes that have to happen. But I think the challenge, that I don't hear a lot of people talking about is, the supply lines. What's your procurement process? For me, I still don't have authorization to spend the federal funds that were granted in December by my legislature yet, and then it's going to take me 4 to 5 months to be able to procure anything. And so, those are real things, and people would have to procure central count vote tally systems. Paper, envelopes. There's just a lot of just logistics that would have to come into place. And that's not even talking about the policies. We've learned a lot doing vote by mail exclusively since the voters approved that in 1998. So over 20 years now. We've been doing it over 30 years. Every election, we learn something new and continue to modify and improve our processes. We're obviously happy to share the things that we've learned, with others, and I'm on the phone all day with, my colleagues in other states, other interested people. But there's a lot of policy making that goes into play here. And I think one of the big things that people need to realize is because we've been doing vote by mail for so long, our voter file is very clean. Because we're having a contact, we're sending some kind of mailer to a voter, at least once a year, and usually 2 or 3 times a year. And so if they've moved, we're going to get information back that says that they've moved. There's an incentive in a vote by mail situation to do that, because I'm having to pay, or the counties are having to pay to mail the ballot out initially. If the person doesn't live there anymore, they've got to pay for it to be returned to them, and then a third time the postage paid to send it to the new address. And so that's time and money that those of you that haven't had to keep your voter rolls as clean as we have, that's something that's going to be a challenge out there. I think voter education. I remember, back in the original HAVA days, and the counties moved from punch cards to optical scan. And I can't tell you how many of those ballots came back that people had punched through the ovals that they were supposed to fill in. And so voter education is a big piece of this. And, and then ultimately there's a bunch of policy decisions that have to be made. Are you going to notify people if their signature doesn't check? What are you going to compare the signature against? Do you have signatures in your voter file now? If not, how are you going to get them? How are you going to authenticate those voters? If the signature doesn't match, if you decide that you're going to notify people, how are you going to do that? How long is that going to take? Is that going to impact your certification? Is that going to impact how soon you can get results out? Those are all huge policy questions that are going to have to be decided if people are trying to move to a vote by mail process that never have. Those that are already doing, 30, 40, 50% vote by mail, it's, you're going to be able to ramp up a lot easier than those that are only doing 5 or 10% today. And those are big policy calls that are going to have to be made. And this election is contentious enough before we added all of this virus stuff to it. Anytime you're changing laws in the middle of a major election, that's just fuel for lawsuits if results end up being close. And so those are all things that we've got to, can't just jump into this. We got to make sure that we do it right. We definitely want to serve the voters. But I would say, we're all having to make lemonade here. And I think the best people to trust to do that are the election experts, the election professionals at the county and state level that are running these elections. Let's let them work their magic and do the best thing they can to serve their voters that they know best. And again, there's not a one size fits all. Vote by mail can help in a lot of areas, but I don't think it's the magic pill that's going to solve all of our problems, especially for those coming up with primaries here in the next couple months.
Thank you, Steve. So Tammy Smith is the Assistant Administrator of Elections in Wilson County, Tennessee. Tennessee is an excuse required state. They don't do a whole lot of voting by mail right now, voting absentee. So Tammy, please explain for us your process, how you go from getting the application through sending out the ballots to processing it when it comes back, and what it might look like if you went up to a 20 or 30% absentee turnout. What would that do to your office? Tammy, if your microphone is...
Thanks for having me, Matt. For us, going in Tennessee to a by mail, mostly by mail, or a lot more by mail, would be a tremendous jump and leap. And Steve said everything that needs to be said about this. We do very little absentee in comparison to most states that do, and it's no excuse absentee, those types of things. It would be a huge jump for us between your people, the people we would need, the procedures that we'd have to put in place, the supplies that we need, funding, our additional list maintenance that we would need to accomplish. There are a lot of things that would need to happen to get us to where Oregon is, and we just need to take baby steps. And I'm assured by our state coordinator, Mark Goins, that they're working on it. They're working to give us guidance on that. And so I trust that they'll give us good procedures and policies in place to take care of that. But it would be a huge, significant difference for us. So we're kind of all unsure right now what we need to be doing. we're trying to our best to prepare, get supplies and prepare as much as we can. But for us to have excuse right now, we can do over 60. So we're expecting a big increase in our over 60 population to request absentee. And for us personally, that would be a 30,000 jump right there over what we normally do. And that is a significant amount of increase in absentee for a county our size.
And I think that's a good point. I think that there are some proposals out there to go all vote by mail. I do think that regardless of the policy changes that might get made, there will be more voting by mail. And so certainly figuring out how to prepare for that is key. Charles Stewart is the founding director of the MIT Election Data Science Lab. I know he has some thoughts on how voters may either adapt this fall or how they may choose to vote. So Charles, would you like to fill us in there?
Yes, thanks, Matt, and thanks to the BPC for sponsoring this today. Yeah, I have a few thoughts related to the interaction between the call for vote by mail and how voters actually will respond. And I mean, the first thing that has to be said, of course, is that we don't know how voters are going to respond. We're viewing that right now in real time, and one hopes that we will learn a lot in the next month or so as state after state. For instance, Wisconsin is coming online in a couple of weeks. They've not had a history with a large number of mail ballots. We see the number growing there in anticipation of their primary. So we're going to learn a lot over the next few weeks about the uptake among voters. But as I step back and try to think about the reaction of voters, there are a few things that I keep in mind that we know from the research in election science and election administration. One of those is that there's a very strong status quo bias among voters in how they vote. That is to say, having established a history of voting in person, voters will continue to vote in person. Not only that, that voters who live in a state like Tennessee, if you live there long enough, you'll begin to believe that the only way to vote is to make it hard to vote absentee, to vote early or on election day. Whereas if you then move to Oregon, pretty soon you begin to believe that voting by mail is the only way to vote. And so wherever voters are right now, they're going to be conflicted, the ones who are paying attention, between heeding the public health warnings and understanding that voting by mail may be the wise thing to do, and their own past history, plus what they've come to believe to be the proper way of voting. And so, we're going to wait and see. But my suspicion is that in the states like Arizona, Florida, other places that have a lot of mail balloting already, it's a common part of the culture. We should see further uptakes. But in other parts of the country where mail voting has not been the way of going, we need to plan that a lot of voters will continue to vote in person. And I think that that's one of the great challenges for this election is, one, not only figuring out what that mix is going to be, but also helping the David Staffords of the world not be the public health professionals, but understand what they can do to create in-person voting environments that are safe for everybody. Another thing just to keep in mind as we try to encourage people to vote more by mail is that right now, on the one hand, in states like Wisconsin, we are seeing a big surge in requests for mail ballots. But by and large, the electorate in a primary, even in a presidential primary, but especially in a presidential primary getting toward the end of the season, we're dealing with people who are experienced with the voting process. The great majority of people, I mean, the later we go into this season, as we go into the June primaries particularly, these will be people who voted before. They're relatively comfortable with the process. The idea of applying for an absentee ballot is an incremental step maybe to what they've done before. When we get into the November season, we're going to see a big surge in turnout. And that surge is going to come from people who vote once every 4 years or are voting for the first time. And so, for those voters, those may be younger voters who don't have a lot of experience dealing with government agencies, with paperwork, with navigating legal language. It's going to be more difficult for them to navigate the process in some states to request absentee ballots. And those are the voters that are most likely to show up on election day. So again, we're going to be learning a lot in the next few weeks about the behavior of voters, but we need to remember that the new voters coming into the electorate in November will not be necessarily the ones who are voting in these primaries. The last thing I'll say is, as part of the push to get people out of voting on election day, there's been a discussion not only of increasing mail balloting, but also increasing early voting, encouraging people, to kind of spread out the voting time. In my initial look at this in some states, it looks like actually early voting centers in many states are more crowded than precincts on election day. It really depends. Again, this is very fact specific and will come down to the specific state or county. But it's not clear that a blanket request for people to vote early would help. Indeed, it could hurt. And so as election officials are planning, as policymakers are writing laws and thinking about what to encourage voters to do, I think that some care needs to be given to the how much we want to encourage voters to vote early. And if we do, then it becomes imperative to think about the organization of those polling places. Excuse me. And so I have some other thoughts, but I'll stop there so we can get to questions. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Charles. I'll remind everybody, if you have a question, please do type it into the chat function. It should be on the left side of your screen. If you cannot see your chat function, we understand that may be the case. You can also email me any questions. My email address is mweil@bipartisanpolicy.org. So I'm just going to go through around a couple questions. Charles may also have some questions for the speakers, and we'll hope to get to the questions from the audience in about 8 to 10 minutes. So Steve, you mentioned a lot of the progress that Oregon has made over the past 20 years, learning something new every time. It seems like the Congress is about to send about $400 million to the states. In a perfect world, obviously not where we are right now, but what are the items that they should be focusing on if they're going to be trying to ramp up vote by mail capacity? And for David and for Tammy, what are the other things that money will be most beneficial for as you're thinking about November voting? So Steve, would you like to take the first chance of that?
Sure. So I think, if you're, moving towards vote by mail, going to increase your numbers, the first thing you need to do is to be developing and improving your relationship with your regional and local postal officials. You can't succeed if they don't succeed. And so that's a huge piece of that. With volume increasing, that's going to impact your different, processes. And it may impact theirs as well. So in Oregon, we have to receive the ballots by the close of polls. Our neighbor to the north, Washington, allows postmarks. And so what we do, and this is something that we've continued to fine tune over the years, is we actually have one of the counties go to our main post office the Monday before election and gather all the ballots that are there so that they don't end up in transit somewhere. And then we'll mark them as received on time and distribute them to the appropriate county. And then we're also there at 8 o'clock when the polls close to collect any other ballots that are there. And so just, building those relationships and being able to do that. The other piece is who's going to print the ballots? Who's going to, are there going to be enough envelopes? Frankly, I told my counties 2 weeks ago, there's going to be more people voting by mail. You need to get on the phone to your vendor today, your envelope vendor, and make sure that you've got enough envelopes to get through November, because there's probably going to be a rush. Some voting systems require specific paper. Is there going to be enough? And so making those plans, but then there's going to have to be policy calls along the way as well. Are you going to notify people if their signatures don't match? What are you going to do for signature comparison? Are you going to require people to apply for and request an absentee ballot and then have to process that? I think that's one of the big pieces here, because that's a whole nother manual process of processing absentee requests. A lot of states scan the signature on that to use for verification. And so if you're not used to doing that, do you have the equipment to do that? Do you have the people to be able to do that? And as Charles was saying, I think, remembering the voters in all of this, I think we're all scrambling trying to work this problem. But we've got to remember what we're trying to do is to serve the voters so that they can cast a ballot and have it count. If they're confused by whatever changes we bring about or don't understand, that's going to be a problem as well. And so this really is a complex question. Again, vote by mail has been fantastic for our voters. They love it. But again, back to Charles's point, that's what we know, and we love it, and we advocate for it every opportunity we can. But also recognize, very similar to legislators, status quo is what they know, and they know what the results are going to be from that. And so those are things that are hard to move away from. So I'll pause there so the others can chime in.
So I guess the 400 million is a lot of money. And I personally am grateful that at least what I've seen thus far, there was not a whole lot of restrictive policy language that went along with it. And I think that's important because I think, as you've heard, flexibility is the key in this, because what works for one state in responding to this current situation is going to be different than other states. And so I think the maximum amount of flexibility that can be preserved for the state and the locals is a good thing. Postage is the first thing that comes to mind. So if you're talking about ramping up significantly vote by mail, and you haven't done that in any huge form previously, postage is the biggest initial cost that you're going to get right off. And then you also have to make that decision, whether it's your own personal decision, as in Florida, we're not mandated to pay return postage. Some individual jurisdictions do, some do not. And so that's a question sometimes that somebody eventually is going to have to make if you're not already in a position where that decision's already been made. Who is going to pay return postage? Is it going to be up to the voters? Is it going to be up to the local jurisdiction? Is it going to be the state, or is there going to be some sort of federal assistance that happens with postage, both outbound and inbound? And then I do have some pretty serious concerns about the supply chain. I know a lot of people that are on this call or have been participating in other calls. It's not like these discussions haven't already begun, including with the vendors, which is an important aspect in all of this, because they are obviously key in all of this, just as the local election officials are. Simply, is there enough paper out there? Is there enough ballot envelopes in order to be able to accommodate a massive expansion? And the design of those materials is something that's extraordinarily important as well, particularly, again, if you haven't been in a position where you're doing large amounts. Key design aspects of your materials can make a big difference in both the voter understanding how to complete the process, as well as their ability to have that ballot counted once it gets back to the local election administrator. So so overall, I think max flexibility in how to spend those dollars, and I think it's going to vary fairly significantly from state to state, and even from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Thank you. Tammy, do you have any thoughts about how you might spend some increased funding?
Obviously, the first thought, as he said, was postage, but some other things that I think states that are in our position or counties in our position would be to utilize what we already have. So like in our case, we have over 60 as an excuse. use that and advertise that and try to leverage that to our benefit to help in this situation. But because I think we're going to also have an issue of getting enough poll workers. We do a lot of early voting. We do probably 73% early voting. Many counties in Tennessee are in the same boat and do that much. So getting enough people to actually work early voting I think that's going to be one of our challenges. But to just use some of the things that we already have, use technology to our advantage. We can start doing barcoding on labels that will help labor. So when the ballots come back in, we're not manually doing everything. We can scan, we can use some of the technology to our benefit. Those are some of the things that I think would help us in small jurisdictions, just right off the bat. Just use some of the things we already have in just a different manner. But the cost is a big issue for us. We've already been hit with cybersecurity on a local jurisdiction level. I mean, some counties are doing a lot of cybersecurity, some counties aren't doing very much, and we get some of that money that goes to states, but overall we're getting hit. So we keep getting all these different things coming up. Funding is always a big issue for us. Supplies, voter education. So we're concerned about all of that, but we are trying to do our part to be proactive and to start now and not be blindsided that we're going to have to do this. And so we want to be prepared, and hopefully everyone in our situation is doing the same thing.
Thank you, Tammy. I'm seeing a lot of good questions coming in on our chat and into my email, so that's why I keep looking over that way. But before I get to them, Charles, do you have any questions you wanted to ask these panelists?
Well, actually, I want to come back to Tammy and follow up a little bit from what she was saying. There's a lot of speculation out there in the various phone calls and emails and conversations that are flying around about what election officials need in order to manage an anticipated surge in vote by mail. And so you mentioned, for instance, if all of your 60 or 65 and over voters would vote, you have 30,000 more ballots. Is that something that you view as being primarily, well, let's just buy another scanner to throw them through? Is it that, well, the people, assuming we can get enough workers, that just means a later night of counting them? How do you think that through? And
well,
yeah.
Yes, we're already starting to think on that path and think it through. And we do have, we have our state laws that we still have to comply with. And one of those is we cannot count or touch a ballot until election morning. So if we were to get a huge surge, we would have to get a lot of people to start election day as soon as it starts to get through the night and not be staying there 2 or 3 days counting ballots. We've already contacted the vendor about leasing a high-speed scanner. Of course, everybody's doing that. So again, we get to the supply chain. Everyone is asking for the same things all across the U.S. So I'm concerned, are they going to be able to provide all of us with everything we need? If we can't get high-speed scanners, then we need people. And so again, that costs a lot of money when you start paying dozen or more people to be counting. So we're in a better situation than most because we went to vote centers this year. And so we actually have some extra equipment for counting, and we can actually use that. And so we have a little bit of advantage in some respects to some other jurisdictions. But that's one of our first concerns, is just having enough people, and when can we start counting? But there's a lot of factors that go into that. How are we going to promote 60 and over? If we promote 60 and over, then what are the other people going to say that want to vote absentee? You don't want to, you've got all those factors to consider, and we are here for the voter, but we're also limited by law, and we're going to follow the law.
Great. So Matt, why don't we get to some of the questions that are coming in from the auditors here?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Not surprisingly, I believe a lot of these questions are for Steve, and the ramping up to vote by mail. I'm going to pick 2 right now, and then I'll try to move around to other people as well. The first one comes from the Committee on House Administration. Certainly, there's been a lot of talk about moving to more vote by mail, and they point out that has its own inherent risks. So, what kind of contingency planning do you do in vote by mail jurisdictions if, say, the postal service is unavailable or unable to deliver for some length of time? And the other question that I've gotten a couple of times for Steve as well is, what do you do about dual language ballots?
Sure. So let me start with the dual language ballots. I saw that one pop up earlier. So we don't have any dual language requirements in Oregon, but when I was in California back in the early 2000s, we had multiple languages, and so we would send bilingual ballots out depending on how many languages that you needed. You know, there's different trade-offs with the U.S. Department of Justice on whether you can identify those that would need those language assistance, different language ballots. I would choose just to send bilingual ballots, just because that's easier, and people don't always self-identify. Kind of in parallel to that, there's not a lot of talk about those voters with accessibility needs. Vote by mail raises some challenges with respect to accessibility needs. And so we've developed alternate format ballot that we can email to people, large print ballots that for those that have some vision. So we've got 3 or 4 different tools to be able to serve those voters with different accessibility needs. And so, that's in addition to what your vote by mail system does. And back to the question of if the post office is not available, then we're in a world of hurt. We could obviously deliver ballots electronically and have people print them out and return them. But that's that would be a challenge that is really too far out there to spend a lot of time on to say that the post office is not going to be there. I think the biggest challenge my counties are having right now is with the social distancing and in their boards that are opening the envelopes, that are verifying the signatures. And so we're looking, and this is something that I think the federal funds could help us with, at setting up some temporary locations, either adjacent to the county election office. I had suggested maybe high school gymnasiums, because the schools are all closed, and then I found out that those are the backups for the hospitals. So just going through those different contingency plannings, looking for space. But that's really my biggest challenge as we administer the election, is really getting more space to spread out in, so that those that are doing those manual processes will be able to have the same number of people doing it, which means we'll have to have more space.
Thank you. Another question I've been seeing a lot pop up, and I've gotten a couple of my email as well, is about UOCAVA voters. So these are voters who are overseas, either citizens or in the military. They're going to have special challenges both for the upcoming primaries, but in November. I know some states allow different things when it comes to how they can participate. Is it possible to scale up any of those things for all voters? And I'll start with Steve, but if Tammy and David have other thoughts, I'd appreciate those as well.
Well, I don't want to say fortunately, but last year we had to consider a lot of these things with the Uniform Postal Union and the discussions on whether we were going to continue to be a part of that. And so I think kind of we have the same challenges now about whether ballots, whether mail is going to be able to get to certain countries and move within them. And so in Oregon, we're allowed we allow voters, UOCAVA voters, to return their ballots either via email or fax, and they can download it from our website, or the counties can email them that ballot. They would print it out and have a package to be able to return that. And so, those are things I think we're confident that we would be able to get ballots back to from our military personnel that are on bases, to be able to get things back that way. And so really we're trying to focus on okay, which countries might be shut down and not get mail, and how are we going to reach out to the voters there to make sure they have an opportunity to return it?
Dave and Tammy, have you thought about that?
Sure. We've got a very large Uocava population here in my county. And so there's solutions out there. Obviously, the Congress, with the MOVE Act several years ago, made some great strides. Delivery of the balloting materials is not, that issue really has kind of been solved because you can get it to them electronically. The rub is getting it back. Obviously, I think everybody on this call knows that there's not universal acceptance of different methods of return other than through the mail. And so anytime you start talking about addressing some accessibility issues for the return of those of that balloting materials, then you get the security side, and then food fight ensues. And so that's kind of kept, I think, some what I would call some more productive conversations from moving forward, but it is what it is. So point is, you can get materials to those voters. Obviously, if there's some disruption in particular jurisdictions, particularly overseas, getting them back, then you're just going to have to deal with that as best as you can. Some states allow electronic delivery, other states don't. We allow fax delivery, but then you go talk to anybody in the military and you talk about fax delivery and they literally laugh in your face. And so one of the other interesting aspects is that you've started to see, and I know that other states have done this, is utilizing those systems for delivery of balloting materials for Uocava voters, for voters with disabilities. And so that's something I think that that's a possibility as well. So could it be done? Yeah, on a larger scale, sure. You got to deal with the logistics of do you need email addresses for folks, and what do you do with those email addresses? How do you get them? How do you make sure they're still accurate? And then something else that hasn't come up, but I think that any folks that have had to deal with large scale duplication of ballots, do not minimize the stress and strain that can put on your operations. If you're not used to duplicating large numbers of ballots, that is a huge time and resource drain on your operations if you're not preparing for that in advance.
So another question I've gotten is we've spent a lot of time speaking about the voter side of this ordeal, and that's certainly important. But all of you manage staffs too, and what are you doing to keep your staff safe, healthy, following all the CDC guidelines of social distancing to make sure that they stay healthy and can administer the election? Tam, you want to take that one?
Sure. Our staff, we have our front door is locked right now, so we're in the petition process. We have a deadline coming up April 2nd. So we have a bell call outside our front door that any visitors can ring, and we come to the door. But we're pretty distanced here already. We don't have our desk right next to each other as far as working every day. So it's really just dealing with the public where we have to be careful. Once we have people come in, we wipe everything down and take care of that. But we do have most people that are doing registrations online, which is an awesome thing, great tool. So most of our registrations are still being done online. It's just right now we're taking in doing petitions. So we're just taking precautions to be careful.
Yeah, Matt, we close as of Monday. Now we're in a little bit of a unique position because our canvassing board meets on Friday. That's another thing you got to consider what to do if the public is, you're limiting gatherings to 10 or fewer, or there's, in other states there's a lockdown. What do you do about public meetings? And so we're moving forward with our we've got a canvassing board meetings on this Friday and then the following Monday to wrap up our election. Friday's certification, Monday's our post-election audit. That's something else you got to consider. As far as staffing is concerned, we've closed our office to walk-in, to public walk-ins. The public can still make appointments should they become necessary. We haven't had a lot of those. A lot of our transactions occur through the Department of Highway Safety Motor Vehicles, through VRA, motor voter transactions, and those have slowed to a trickle, as you can imagine, because those offices are also closed to the public. So we're in the midst of, beginning next week, we're going to kind of go half staff on, half staff off to further minimize our own internal crowds, if you will, within our operation. But we still are open to the public via telephone and other electronic means, and then by appointment only.
Yeah, I think that was an important point that wasn't brought up earlier, David, about the departments of motor vehicles closing. And certainly, we do tend to see spikes in voter registration during a presidential election year. If those voters are already in the database, they can access the online portals that you have, but that's not going to be an option if they're not already in the DMV databases. So I do wonder what this is going to mean and what the impact is going to be on voter registration as this goes forward. There was a question very specifically for David, and then I'll broaden it, about what percentage of ballots are you doing duplication on?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that varies from election to election. So when we get into particularly general elections, and particularly presidential general elections, because of the method of return for a lot of our UOCAVA voters, that receive their balloting materials electronically, that's a big that's a rather large number. We've put in procedures. We learned the hard way, but put in procedures where we could do those duplications in advance, so we weren't left sort of on election night with huge volumes of late arriving duplication of ballots. And you have your routine duplication of damaged ballots, or if there's you've seen isolated incidents where there may be a printing error or something, and then you don't, it slipped by in testing, and then you come back. This hasn't happened to us, just a full disclosure, but I've seen it in other jurisdictions where then you have to have a mass duplication of ballots in order for them to be tabulated. So, from the routine, I guess the other thing that I would say, and I know it's been hit on before, but if you're starting, we're allowed to begin tabulating our ballots, canvassing our ballots 22 days before Election Day. And we're mandated by the state within the first 30 minutes of polls closing on election night to report 100% of our early votes and 100% of all vote by mail ballots that we've canvassed up to that point. So by 7:30 p.m. here in the state of Florida, you've got normally between 50 and 60% of the votes cast in that election are reported, and I know that's vastly different than how other states do it, but that's just the situation we find ourselves here in Florida.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll note there's about 10 minutes left, and then so if you have any final questions, make sure you get those into the chat or into my inbox quickly. Another question about voting by mail. How do you handle voters who don't have addresses? This is a particular concern on many of the Indian lands, but there are many people who don't have access to mail regularly. So how do you reach those voters?
Yeah, no, so that's one of those things we've worked on over the years, and we've got procedures in place for the homeless to identify where they usually locate, and then they can pick their ballot up at the county elections office or at any other government office or address that they go to be able to access. Similar things we've worked with the tribes, recognizing that people move a lot, and so trying to get ballot specific to the right area, and trying to make sure that they have a similar, or hopefully the same ballot style, so that it doesn't really matter whether they live in one end of town or the other. And so just trying to work with those communities to identify a place. The real key here is, where do we precinct them, so that we know what contest they have to be able to cast a vote for. That's the first step, and then the second step is, how do we get the ballot picked up to be able to move. And just kind of sorry to backtrack to two previous questions earlier. DMV shutting down is impacting our automatic voter registration process because people aren't going in to get new licenses, and so they're not getting automatically registered. And then kind of a follow-up to my postal, if the post office shuts down, one thing I forgot to mention is over 60% of our voters return their ballots to Dropbox. And so we would be able to expand that and still have those as a viable option.
I have a question for Charles, certainly about your status quo question, status quo bias commentary. How can election administrators make considerations for local voter populations that have traditionally or historically been disenfranchised and may not trust voting by mail? Because we know that's certainly a problem if we're going to do more voting by mail.
Right, which is one of the reasons why, one of several reasons why it's important to have safe and healthy in-person polling places. So that's certainly, part of it. And related to that, and it's picking up on something that Steve said as well, is that for some people it may be sufficient to drop off a ballot, even if one has questions about whether a mail ballot would make it back. And so that's where, states that don't allow for the drop off of ballots on election day, or make it difficult to drop off a ballot on election day, might want to think about those laws. Because, and as Steve noted, in Oregon, and it's true in the 3 so-called vote by mail or vote at home states, most voters now are returning their ballots in person at drop boxes or early vote centers. When I was down observing vote center activity in Orange County, California, a couple of weeks ago, 80% of the business I saw was people coming in, dropping off ballots. And so that's something that could be a fine adaptation. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time in the facility to drop off the ballot, not as much as if you're checking in and marking your ballot. Having remote places to drop off a ballot, perhaps those sorts of things may meet the concern. But at the end of the day, there will be people for a wide variety of reasons who will need to access a polling place on election day. Getting back to the AVR situation, especially in the states that have election day registration. If people find it hard to get driver's licenses and update their or get new registration that way, they're going to need a polling place. And so polling places are not going to go away. Even in Oregon, you can go into an office on election day, and if you have a problem or something like that, there are always going to be places that voters can go, even when you've maximized postal voting. And so so they just need to be safe and available for people who want them for whatever reason.
So I'll say there are way more questions than I have time for. So we may have to do more of these. If you guys will all come back and listen to our future webinars, we'll do that. I did want to bring back in the security question, though, for our last question. Security has been the major focus for the past 3.5 years. I think that was, if you asked any of you a month ago, probably your main focus for this election. What happens if someone tries to hack into our databases or whatever? A lot of people point out that the decentralized nature of our voting process is one of its keys to repelling those kind of attacks. If we're going to see more voting by mail, if we're going to see more strain on those vendors, what are some of your new worries when it comes to election security in this new environment? Who wants to go first? I'll make David go first.
So I think it's evolving right now. Probably the most immediate is from a staffing perspective. So if you have all these cross pressures, right? So if you're trying to keep people away from the office, right? So then there's a big push towards remoting in, people working from home, and that in and of itself increases your security risk. I think in, how it's done, and of course, and I'm not a tech guy, but how it's done and who's doing it and what, safeguards do you have in place is a big issue. But I think generally, if you have more people remoting in, that generally increases your risk profile. I'll go out on a limb and say that. So those are some of the more immediate concerns, and I know there's been conversations ongoing and guidelines that have been put out for how to do it safely and whatnot. But in Florida, we run 3 elections. Really, we run 3 elections for every election. We run a mail ballot election, we run a vote center election, and we run an election day election. We just do it all at the same time. So we've got experience in kind of dealing with the security concerns with each of those methods. But as you start changing things, particularly kind of on the fly, which is some of what we had to do in this past presidential, you of course assume some additional level of risk, and it's all about risk mitigation. So I think that's an evolving part of it as you increase. For instance, again, as I mentioned earlier, you talk about accessible. You can make elections accessible by emailing everybody a ballot, but of course you've got huge risks inherent in something like that. So there always has to be a balance. And so I guess the best thing I would say is it's evolving, but it's always front and center.
Tammy and Steve, any thoughts on security in the new environment?
So I'll just say, we can't lose sight of the security piece of this. Everybody's focused about how we're going to deal with the virus and all that, but the security threat is still real. It may be more of a threat in the current environment, but I think my biggest concern as we entered 2020 was misinformation, and I think that's still my biggest concern. And given people concerned about how they're going to get their ballot cast, questions about how Vote by Mail really works, I think that we're susceptible to even more misinformation. So I think events like this, getting the word out, helping to educate folks on what really is working and what a great job our election risk managers are doing to deal with all these challenges is something that we have to do even more of. We all knew 2020 was going to be a crazy year, even before we had all the security and the pandemic to deal with. So it's going to weigh on us. We've got to take care of ourselves. I got to take care of my team and the county partners. It's crazy, and we got to keep each other built up.
Tammy, any final thoughts?
I would agree with what Steve said. We can't lose sight of what we've been working on with security. So many of us have put so much effort into making sure everything is secure, safe and secure. So, and this is a good time for those that have been trying to get in to do things a little bit differently to catch us off guard. So we can't lose sight of that. But I'm also really proud of everybody that's doing all of this, everybody on the panel, everybody that's in the conversations of how to still make 2020 elections good, safe, and secure. I wish the general public could see some of the conversations and join in some of the conversations, because disinformation is what we fight the most. Is in this kind of conversation, I think it would build some trust that we are doing our very best to make sure that we still have good elections, and to make sure that everybody can cast a vote and it's protected and the integrity of that vote is secure. So I'm just really proud of everybody that's doing their best to still have a good election.
That's a great segue into me saying that this video will be available on BPC's website later today. This is also the point in any panel where I'd ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists. I know you can't do it. I will do it here. But I also wanted to note that I really appreciate the work my team did. Collier, Tim, Michael, Emma, Rachel, putting this together in the span of about 24 hours. I think it worked well. I appreciate that everyone was able to join this meeting and stay with us for the entire hour, and expect to hear some more things from us in the near future. So again, thank you, and we'll see you all soon.